Once again, Karibuni Keita Ladies Night, and of course, Happy New Year from us. And today we have a special guest who I don't know if she shares the sentiments that it is a new year, but that we will discuss on the side. I am talking about a communication strategist at the World Bank and so many other titles I really have to go back and refer. But her name is Lilly Bekele-Piper. Did I say it right?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. So maybe you can tell them better. You know your titles.
Sure. Yeah. I've worked in communications a long time. Currently, I'm a communications and strategist consultant at the World Bank. But my real passion is creative communication, and especially the places where that meets human rights advocacy. So I started a podcast about a year ago called Uproot that tells stories of immigration, of the diaspora, of women, as you've mentioned, and empowering women, but also stories that are very much rooted in the continent and in East Africa.
Uproot. I can see where the name gets brings in the content of the show. And of course, for me personally, I don't know what a communication strategist is. So what is that exactly?
Question. Well, you know, so many of us, we rely on communication no matter what our field of work is, whether you're a medical professional or if you are an artist. You have to be able to get your message across. You have to be able to tell your story. So that's a lot of what I do. Is I work in the health sector, so I'm trying to tell the story of what the work is that's being done in Kenya and the region, and why it matters, why it's important, and what it means to both people on the ground, stakeholders, as well as those in government and policy-making decisions.
So you make the way I get it, and maybe for someone else who's struggling with this as well, is you make communication easier between the consumer and the person taking in.
Yeah.
I think we have it.
Yeah,
so now we can move forward. And you're an expert as well in international education.
Well, that's a very high compliment to say I'm an expert. I would say I'm still a student of international education for sure. Been working in that field for over a decade, but as you know, education is always evolving. We're always trying to improve what works for kids, what works for teachers, what works for communities. And so I'm very much still a student of international education, but in small ways, you know, get to play a small role in that.
Yeah. From communications to your passion projects with you said women empowerment to gender equality.
Well, my podcast focuses on stories of both women and men, but of course, you know, as a woman, you're always drawn to those stories of other women.
Yeah. So of course, from the communication strategist to now dealing with the problems and getting into the actual roots of what's happening in society, did you see there's a communication barrier happening, or what were you trying to fix with the podcast?
That's a good question. I think with my podcast, I don't know that I'm trying to fix something as much as I am trying to offer another platform. I think so many of the stories that are about Kenya, I'm Ethiopian, so the stories about Ethiopia, about East Africa, about the continent are written and spoken by others, not by us. And so part of what I try and do on Uproot is give myself and others a platform to tell our stories, to share our histories, to share our successes, to wrestle with the challenges we face. I'm also the product of the US. I immigrated there when I was a child and have now come back to the continent. We left about 13 years ago. So part of what the Uproot does is also give a place to talk about what is it like when you're balancing two identities or two places you might call home. I have kids, and so they're also dealing with that, and so I talk a lot about what it means to be a child who is a part of many cultures, 2, 3 cultures, and how do you navigate that. And so I think Uproot is always trying to tell those stories, to highlight stories that are joyful, that are talking about the resilience of our communities, and at the end of the day, I hope start new conversations and increase people's awareness of how incredible this place is.
Yeah, and of course you're trying to fix something that like you said, you grew up in the US and then you relocated back to Africa, specifically Kenya or Ethiopia?
We went back to Ethiopia 13 years ago, spent 4 years there, and now we've been in Nairobi the last 8 or so.
So it's your home now.
Home,
So basically, someone could argue that you're looking at it from a point of sympathy other than understanding, because I know better what we're going through. I know better the problems that I need to fix, the solutions I can give. Yes, you have the training from a very good school. You went to Harvard. Congratulations on that. I don't know if people say congratulations or what, but congratulations on that. You have the techniques of a first world country, but the problems that are deep-rooted, that are from the ground up, that we know in depth, that you might not be able to understand. So what do you do when someone could argue that you're not in a position of understanding, but a position of sympathy and just, you know, going back to your identity and trying to find your place.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think professionally, if it's a professional work situation, well, actually, any situation. As I said earlier, I feel like I'm a student and I'm still a learner, and I hope I'll always have that position when I approach a new person or a new topic. In professional spaces, there are, of course, some skills I bring to bear, and I think I'm very good at what I do. But I don't think that I'm sympathetic. I think not in the sense maybe that I feel sorry for this place. No, because even though I may have grown up in the US, I was never disconnected from Ethiopia. I mean, I'm fluent in my language. My parents raised me in the cultures and the traditions of my people. I grew up with a very strong sense of identity, purpose. The message that we got growing up was always give back and come back. And so as soon as I could do that, we did. And so I think I do understand the problems on the ground from one angle, but I'm always learning. I'm always trying to ask more questions and understand more deeply, because my experience has been different. And a lot of the stories I tell is also about being an immigrant, what it's like to go to a new country with parents who have no idea the culture or the norms, and then growing up really maybe not lost, but unsure. I spent, so much of my childhood trying to figure out what it meant to be an American, what it meant to be an African or an East African. And so wherever I am in the world, I feel like I'm always learning and always trying to figure out, what's next and how do I listen and how do I learn, and hopefully instead of sympathize, that I can be empathetic, whoever it is that I'm talking to.
So let's talk about Uproot, which seems like more of a passion project other than your day-to-day job. It's something you've set out to do at your own time with probably your own money, your own commitment, setting time aside to do something you're passionate about. So tell us more about Uproot.
Sure, I'd love to tell you more about it. So I started it because I felt my experiences were not unique. I felt like there were so many people that I met who were in between cultures or languages or places. And so this year I just really made it a goal that I wanted to be intentional about telling those stories and to be a conduit for those stories on Uproot. I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary last week with a live show. Thank you. At Village Market, and the topic was, who am I? Understanding identity through race, religion, and language. And I had 3 Kenyans on who were talking about identity from different perspectives. A Muslim woman who's also a physician, a Kenyan Ugandan who's grown up across the world, and then Jason Dunford, a white Kenyan who's had a very global experience. And so all of them helped me understand both my experience better, but also this is what Uproot is all about. It is giving a platform for us on the continent to, again, define who we are to the world, to tell our stories, to tell our struggles, to tell our successes. And at the same time, I think, create a place where we can ask questions and engage in those places that we, it's not always correct to ask about somebody's religion or to ask about somebody's racial identity and how that affects them. And so I hope on Uproot we can give people a chance to have those conversations. And after they listen to that conversation, hopefully they go home and they talk to their neighbor, their mother, their friend, and continue having those dialogues that hopefully improve all of our awareness and hopefully improve all of our understanding.
And of course, my question would be, in matters, like you said, identity purposes. We live in a country, I don't know about the continent, but in a country where we're defined by our tribe, what language you speak. So communication can be a problem, not because you don't speak my language. A few years back, we had the post-election violence where you are being categorized based on what you speak, like what is your language, what's your identity, and it makes you worthy or unworthy to live. There was a point in time we got to that. And we're fighting so many things. Do you feel like this is also a barrier to growth? Because people believe, like, I will help my people to move up. There's a community that says, I will also help my people to move up. So someone could argue, then you don't need to connect either that. If you're willing to help your people, go ahead. Then this one will do it. But do you feel like the lack of communication between these two people is a hindrance to development or something of sorts?
I can only speak from my perspective, but I can say that in Ethiopia we're having similar struggles between ethnic groups and who has access to power, who has access to resources. And I think the story of our continent through hundreds of years, and quite frankly, the whole entire world, when you see conflict emerging on the world stage, it's because it's usually a fight over resources. It's not necessarily about ideologies or identity. it's a scarcity of resources, and then people feel like, okay, if I don't assert my power, my strength, then my people, my community will lack and they won't have. And so it's not uncommon, I think, in the human experience. And I think you're right. I think communication is so important. I think, Ethiopia and Kenya have some similarities in terms of a national language that was born out of kind of the, around after independence here in Kenya, and then in Ethiopia a bit longer. But, the languages that we say are our national languages, or in Kenya I think there's two, and in Ethiopia we really have one, but, business has to operate in both English and Amharic and others. Communication will always be a critical part of, how we define ourselves. That will be, I think it has to be on the agenda of every government of how to do it successfully and well. And I think the generation behind us is really learning how to do it in their own new ways. I think so much of, if we look at Sudan and the revolution that happened there, other political movements, they didn't happen in government meetings or in parliament. They happened on social media, they happened on Twitter, they happened in clubs and social spaces where people organized and said, we are going to take the messages that we feel are important and put them to the people. We're going to take them to the streets, essentially, through music. You see that in Kenya all the time. Protest and resistance shows up through music. And so I think there's so many ways to communicate. I don't think there's any one right way, but I think you're right in that it's going to always be important. We always have to both talk to each other within countries, but then, across those borders also.
I don't know if I have it right, but I think there's a political movement happening in Ethiopia at the moment. And there's so many people, there's a lot of refugees that come from Ethiopia, Somalia, those countries. Yeah. And a lot of you are going back home. And there's some fight from the people within saying, you guys do not understand, or do I have it wrong?
No, you're not incorrect. I mean, there is some tension, I think, that exists broadly between diaspora voices and then national voices, and trying to find a place for that. I mean, we know statistically that sub-Saharan Africa relies on remittances from abroad, be it Europe or North America, for economies to function. It's true of Kenya, it's true of Ethiopia, it's true of literally every country in sub-Saharan Africa. We have to engage the diaspora. There has to be a pathway to engage them economically, educationally, socially, etc. And I think what we're experiencing now in Ethiopia is, when you're thinking about nation building, when you're thinking about, collaboration and the future of a country, how do you make space for those people who then also have the option to leave, who maybe invested differently because they have an additional passport? It's a complicated conversation. I think, again, I hope I can be a learner in that space and not assert myself with any kind of privilege that, when it gets tough, I can just leave and go home to the U.S., whatever that means. I hope that I never take that position. Yeah. But I think there's that tension for many of us, Twitter is a powerful place, and when people start sending messages and messages gain momentum, and those messages are not from within the country but from without, of course, you start to ask the question of who gets to be the narrative, who gets to drive the story. Yeah,
I just felt like I should mention that because I was really curious about it and I didn't have any insight. But maybe back to something you mentioned where you said the young people are the ones who are the change, of course. But we're looking at a generation of people where it's more visual than it is about the work. People don't want to put in the work. And with us, like probably the upcoming elections, they're a bit enlightened where they talk about, the music is out there condemning the politicians, doing all that, and everyone is championing for that. But when it comes to showing up for voting or showing up to rallies or showing up to, how do you call them, protests, millennials are nowhere to be seen, We're Twitter, how do you call us, keyboard warriors, we fight, but we don't show up. And you deal with language, communication. How do you, and like you've mentioned, club music, but the thing is, they can't take the polling station to the clubs. They can't take it to the whatever places. So how do you communicate to people that things are going wrong and everyone can see it? So wake up, go do this and change everyone's life for the better, because I think we are the majority in population. So what language do you speak to them as a strategist? What do you tell them?
That's a great question, and I am not a political strategist, so I don't have any good professional viewpoint on that. But what I can speak to now is as a mother who has a daughter who will be able to vote in the next American elections. So flip to that, as you were saying earlier, do I have that tension? It does exist. In the U.S., as everyone knows, we're struggling with a government that I don't think represents a majority of people, and certainly has policies and practices and a culture in place that's very anti.
No, like you mentioned, you're not a political strategist.
Yeah.
I feel like the political part is set. Now
Yeah.
it's the language you're using to tell them, like, now you know all the problems. You're
Right.
all talking about it. Like, how do you speak to them and tell them, go out and
But I
change
think
something?
we have a tension here in the continent, to be honest with you. I think we tell our young people in social settings, stand up when elders come in, greet them, don't speak anything, especially if it's in contrast to whoever the patriarchal figure is in the room. You know, serve the tea, sit quietly, and when we need something from you, to sing a song or whatever, we'll let you know. That's the message we tell them socially. So then I think it's very hypocritical for us then to say, but we want you in the streets, we want you to vote, when they don't have secure secondary funding or fees to cover their education, or there's a real employment risk to them if they take time off to show up at a protest. What will their employer do? And they're 21, they're 22, and we're asking them, you know, to put their work on the line. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think it's important. I've taken my own children to protest. They've made signs. They've walked in places that are very uncomfortable to be, because as a family, it's a priority to us to be politically engaged and to be active citizens. We say to our kids all the time, freedom isn't free. So if you want freedom, then you need to go pay the price for it, whether that's writing to your, you know, in the US, writing to your senator or your representative. Here in Kenya, it's a different system, but still to engage however you can politically. But I think as East Africans, we do have to wrestle with the narratives that we're sharing. We can't tell young people both speak only when you're spoken to, and at the same time expect them to show up for us when we need them, you know? I think there's a real tension there, and I think politicians, community leaders who are wise, I think there's several of them in Kenya who are pushing the messages forward, but I think those who are wise of every generation will sit with those people in the places where they are, go to their schools, go to their communities, go to the places where they gather, and instead of talking at them, invite them to ask you questions, to have the conversation. I think as somebody who's in the humanitarian professional space and now trying to create communication avenues, the one thing that I'm always amazed at is that when it's International Day of the Girl Child or when it's International Day of Youth, you have all these adults talking at the kids, about the kids. You don't see the kids themselves owning those platforms. And I think it's because we're not always willing to share with them the space to say, you know, you take the show for the next 30 minutes. You tell us what's the message you want to hear. So I don't know, it's complicated. I think there's a lot we can do and a lot we can learn.
Like you mentioned, you're a humanitarian and you do a lot with gender equality. You're pushing for that, especially in Africa. And I like that you have a view from both sides, you know, like we're trying to get to the level where the United States is, where everyone is free to be who they are, where there's equality for everyone. But you're in a society where, of course, our cultures and religions are also a big thing. And the talk needs to be there, but everyone's like, no, we don't want to listen. You know, you're going against this and going against that. But you're talking to not a marginalized group, but it's a very... It's a podcast, so whoever's choosing to listen is someone who already knows something about that. So what about the rest who have no clue about this?
No, I mean, I think that's why I'm grateful for opportunities like today to be here on your show to talk about it, because I think it's there's, if you look at it as, you know, as if you're flying an airplane, you're looking down, you can see the whole map of a city, and you can see, okay, this community here is affected this way and that one. But so many times we don't get that view, the bird's eye view. We're down on the ground, we're in our own space, and we're consumed by only what touches us. And I think the beauty of the podcast is to try and elevate the voices of those who are not, you know, getting a lot of attention or getting a lot of space to talk about the issues. I just did an episode a few weeks ago about orphanage tourism, about the fact that, you know, 80 to 90% of children in children's homes across the world have a living parent. And yet the holidays come up and we are all visiting children's homes and giving clothes and money. And it's that kind of patronage that keeps these places in business. And they become businesses. And so those children in those institutions don't have these public spaces always. And so I feel like on my podcast, what I can do is invite people on. So I had 2 adults who grew up in children's homes on the show, Stephen Usembe and Ruth Washuka. And Stephen is the founder of the Kenyan Society of Care Leavers. So care leavers being those children who are now adults who left care, who grew up entirely in institutions. When they turned 18, they received the 10,000 shillings from the government to start their lives. And they were basically told, you know, good luck. 10,000 shillings, start your life in society. And so Stephen started this organization to support people like him who left not having the support support of a family unit, not knowing how to, become a member of society. And so, for me, that's something that I'm passionate about. It's the human rights of every child deserves a family. And so how can we do better? Well, we can do better when we know better, when we have information. And so that podcast, I had them on, we recorded it, and then what I did from there is try and share it in every network I had. I shared it with my church community, because we know churches are often ones who patronize these children's homes. I shared it with, graduate school alumni networks. I shared it with family and friends, who then shared it and shared it and shared it. And I hope over time that spreads, and that people will start to look to Uproot to help, provide that kind of information, to promote issues of justice, and that we can be a part of, solutions.
Yeah, information is power.
Yes.
Something that everyone champions. But I feel like I even gave off that vibe when you came in, and I asked you, like, what right do you have to speak on that, Yeah. And someone who's lived here all their life, has dealt with all these things, and maybe feels like, nothing needs to change. You guys are bringing in your own ideas and trying to enforce them here when things are really not that bad, like you're trying to change. So how do you convince someone to leave that sort of mentality and just listen and say, here's the change we need?
I really believe in relationships. I really believe that every opinion that I've had that has changed, it's because I had a relationship with somebody who had experienced something, and then I learned something, not intellectually, but like emotionally. It's like that head and heart connection. So to be honest with you, I would very much agree with those people who say, leave us alone. I mean, I'm an advocate of that myself. It's like, let us live, let us decide what needs change. My father often talks about, my father grew up very poor in a city outside of Harar, Ethiopia. He didn't have shoes growing up, the whole story, right? The African story. He was one of 9 children. He lost 6 of his siblings in childhood, not in infancy, but siblings he knew and had a relationship. And 6 of them died because of poverty-related diseases. But he always told us growing up, I was poor, but we were happy. We had a family unit. I had a mother, I had a father. There was joy in our household. And so the West would look at that and say, but you're poor, but you're living this way. You needed help, you needed aid. And he would say, no, we didn't. I'm a strong believer that talent is universal, opportunity is not. So where I feel like I can make a difference or contribution is increase opportunities. So whether that's increasing opportunities for voices to be elevated, or if it's increasing opportunities to create collaboration and create opportunities for people who may not have that, whatever I've had, then yes. But then to say, this is poor, that lacks, I hope I would never do that. I hope that I can be, I'm a daughter of this place. This is my home. And so I hope that I'm always remembering what I've been taught, who I am. It's not always, I don't always succeed. There's sure many times I make those mistakes, but my parents both of my parents grew up in very marginalized places, but with so much love. And so I hope Uproot can be a way to highlight just how amazing and powerful and intact our communities are.
And like you said, you can't tell someone is poor. Like, my mom always tells me the same thing. We never had much, but we were so happy. She says it all the time, and I'm like, I cannot relate. I'm a millennial. And that's the one thing I know, and it's part of diversity, not necessarily in cultures, but also in just living. It's a part of diversity as well. I'd really like to follow the conversation, and I'm sure people at home as well, because these are issues that you don't really get to talk about on the daily, unless you're home and you're talking to someone you do know. These are actually very intimate and personal conversations that people should have on larger settings like this. So maybe you can tell the people at home where they can find and listen to the podcast, and also maybe follow you on social media and everything else.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So they can find me on Facebook and Instagram. It's at Uproot the Podcast. Very simple, at Uproot the Podcast. They can find me on Twitter at Uproot and Lil. Lill, at Uproot and Lil. I think at Uproot, the podcast was taken, or it was too long or something. So Twitter's a bit different. And then I have a website, uprootthepodcast.com, which has all of the episodes that I've curated, 19 this year. So stories very diverse. Wanjira Mathai was on the show, and she talked about, living a legacy. We've had third culture kids on there talking about what it's like to grow up as multiple identities. So a lot of range of topics. So uprootthepodcast.com is probably the best place to find everything.
All right, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having
Lilly. What name do you prefer going by?
Lilly is perfect.
Lilly is perfect.
Good,
we hope to see you soon. I hope to be part of your podcast one time, hopefully.
Thank you, that'd be wonderful.
Ladies, I do not go anywhere, so I'm break it, but we'll be right back.